Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The journey begins. Olivia Carter, a U.S. Marine, had spent 6 long months serving in the harsh, unrelenting conditions of the Middle East. Every day was a battle, both physically and mentally. As a black woman in the military, she had faced challenges that few could understand. Her identity, defined not only by her service but by her race, had always been something she carried with her, both as a source of pride and as a reminder of the adversities she had to overcome. After months of being stationed in a foreign land, away from her loved ones, Olivia was finally returning home. The plane ride, a brief respite from the chaos of the battlefield, seemed like a luxury she hadn't experienced in months. As she stood in the crowded airport, her military uniform the same one she had worn during countless missions, she felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. The heat of the desert and the constant stress had worn her down physically, but she couldn't help but smile at the thought of seeing her family again. Yet, as she stood in line at the security check, she couldn't escape the familiar feeling that she was being watched. Curious glances, subtle stares, she had learned to ignore them long ago. Being a black woman in uniform had always drawn attention, not just because of her service, but because of the color of her skin. Olivia had learned to tune it out, to focus on her mission and her purpose. She knew her worth, and she wasn't about to let anyone's judgment make her doubt it. Once she cleared security, the announcement for her flight to New York echoed across the terminal. "First class for Flight 752 is now boarding," the voice over the PA system called out. Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she checked her boarding pass. "First class," she murmured to herself in surprise. She had never expected this. The long, uncomfortable military flights were something she had grown accustomed to, but a seat in first class felt like a small luxury she hadn't earned but was grateful to receive. With a sense of relief washing over her, Olivia made her way to the gate, eager to finally settle into a comfortable seat. When she arrived at the boarding gate, the attendant quickly scanned her boarding pass and gestured toward the entrance. "You're all set, Miss Carter. Enjoy your flight." The first-class cabin was much more spacious than she had imagined. As Olivia stepped through the doorway, she saw the plush seats, the larger aisles, and the calm, quiet atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the crowded economy section she was used to. It was almost surreal to be here. She had been to war, faced down life-threatening challenges, and yet here she was, sitting in a seat meant for the fortunate few. As she settled into her seat, her legs, tired from the long wait at the airport, finally had room to stretch. For a moment, she closed her eyes, savoring the comfort. She thought back to the months she had spent in the Middle East, her mind drifting to the faces of her comrades, the stories they had shared, and the bonds they had formed. Those memories made her stronger. The challenges she had faced abroad had taught her resilience, and now she was coming home, her duty fulfilled. But little did she know, this flight home would be far from ordinary. She had barely settled in when she felt someone's gaze on her. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it was simply a fellow passenger noticing her uniform. But as she looked up, her eyes locked with those of a middle-aged man who stood in the aisle. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his face etched with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Olivia blinked, caught off guard. The tone of his question wasn't just about her seat. There was something else in his voice, a hint of skepticism that made her stomach tighten. She looked at the boarding pass in her hand and then glanced up at him. "This is my seat," she replied softly, her voice calm, despite the tension she could feel building. The man didn't move. Instead, he stood there, blocking the aisle, his eyes scanning Olivia from head to toe, first her uniform, then her face, and finally, her skin. There was no mistaking the judgment in his eyes, the clear implication that a woman like her didn't belong in first class. "This is first class," he said again, his voice laced with a quiet but unmistakable disdain. "Are you sure this is your seat?" Olivia had been through situations like this before, though rarely so direct. Racism, she had learned, didn't always hide behind obvious slurs or insults. Sometimes, it was a look, a comment, a slight, something that let you know you were different, that you didn't belong. Taking a deep breath, Olivia stood her ground. "I'm certain," she said firmly, holding up her boarding pass for him to see. "This is my seat." But the man wasn't ready to accept it. His face twisted with anger, his lips tight as he stared at the ticket in her hand. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, still unwilling to believe that she, a black woman, could be sitting in a place meant for people like him. The flight attendant, who had been watching the exchange, finally stepped forward. Her uniform crisp, her demeanor professional, she offered a polite smile, though her eyes had already taken in the growing tension. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The man quickly turned to the attendant, his irritation now palpable. "This woman is in the wrong seat," he said, his voice rising just a little. "This is first class. She doesn't belong here." The attendant didn't flinch. She glanced at Olivia, who sat with an air of quiet dignity, and then at the man's ticket. After a brief moment, she turned back to the man. "Sir," she said, her voice unwavering, "Miss Carter's ticket is valid. She is seated in the right place. I'm afraid there's no mistake here." The man's face reddened, but he said nothing more. With a huff, he reluctantly returned to his seat. As he did, Olivia could feel the eyes of the other passengers in the cabin, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some simply uncomfortable. She kept her gaze forward, focusing on the journey ahead. She had faced much worse in her life, but this small battle, this battle of perception, was something that felt all too familiar. As the plane began to taxi, Olivia settled back into her seat, her mind racing. She had learned not to react in anger, not to give in to frustration. The battlefield had taught her that patience was often more powerful than rage. But deep down, she felt a familiar sting, the reminder that no matter how far she went, no matter what she accomplished, there would always be those who saw her as less than. And it hurt. But she was determined not to let it ruin her flight. She was going home to the people who loved her, to a place where her value wasn't determined by her skin color or her uniform. And no matter what that man thought, she had earned every ounce of the respect she was due. As the plane lifted off, she closed her eyes, hoping to find a moment of peace amidst the turbulence that life so often threw her way. She knew that this was just one chapter in her story, a story of resilience, of strength, and of never backing down, no matter the odds. The fight was far from over, but Olivia Carter was ready to face it. Unseen battles. As the plane ascended into the skies, Olivia Carter sat quietly in her seat, her body slightly reclined, yet her mind was far from relaxed. The hum of the engines was a distant sound in her ears as her thoughts drifted back to the time she had spent serving in the Middle East. The dust, the constant noise of gunfire, the scent of the desert, these were things she would never forget. But more than the war itself, what had stayed with her were the moments of camaraderie she had shared with the men and women by her side. In those moments, they weren't defined by their skin color, their gender, or their rank, they were simply soldiers, bound together by a common cause. Yet now, in this first-class cabin, those same qualities that had united them on the battlefield seemed to separate her from others. The quiet, judgmental glares, the subtle whispers, Olivia had grown used to them over the years. They were a part of life for someone like her, someone who wore the uniform but wasn't always welcomed in spaces where people like her didn't belong. She had learned to carry herself with pride, despite the subtle prejudice she had encountered all her life. But there was always a part of her that wondered, how much longer could she keep fighting this battle? The encounter with the man earlier, though disturbing, wasn't the first time Olivia had faced such discrimination. She had grown up in a small town in Georgia, where the legacy of the Civil War still lingered in the minds of some. Even as a child, Olivia had learned that her skin color meant she would often have to work harder to prove herself. Whether it was on the school playground, in the classroom, or on the athletic field, she had learned that she could never just be Olivia. She had to be Olivia, the black girl, who had to prove her worth time and time again. When she enlisted in the Marines, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The military wasn't always kind to women, and even less so to black women. There were whispers behind her back, side glances, and the occasional sarcastic comment about affirmative action. But Olivia wasn't one to shy away from a challenge. She wanted to serve her country and prove that she could do whatever the men around her could do, and do it better. And she had. She had been deployed to some of the most dangerous zones in the Middle East, where life was cheap, and every day was a struggle for survival. But despite the constant threats and the hardship, Olivia had risen to every occasion, earning the respect of her comrades. Still, the prejudice she had encountered throughout her life was always there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to rear its ugly head at the slightest provocation. It was exhausting. There were days when Olivia wished she could just escape from it all, find a place where she could be seen for who she truly was, not a black woman, not a soldier, but simply Olivia. The flight attendants continued to pass by, offering snacks and drinks to the first-class passengers, but Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that people were still watching her. It wasn't the normal gaze of curiosity. No, this was something different, something colder. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, and for a brief moment, she felt vulnerable. It was as if the space she was in wasn't truly hers, despite the ticket that said it was. Her mind began to wander again, and before she could stop it, memories of her last mission in the Middle East surfaced. It had been a covert operation deep behind enemy lines. The mission was supposed to be quick, in and out, but nothing ever went according to plan in war. The team had been ambushed, caught in a deadly crossfire. Bullets had torn through the air like a storm of metal, and the sound of explosions had been deafening. Olivia had found herself in the thick of it, leading her team through the chaos, navigating the battlefield with the kind of precision and focus that came from years of training. In that moment, there was no room for fear. There was no time for doubt. The mission came first, no matter the cost. As the mission ended and the dust settled, Olivia had emerged as a hero in the eyes of her comrades. She had saved lives, directed fire, and led them to safety through what seemed like an impossible situation. But when they returned to base, no one spoke of her heroism. Instead, the conversation turned to something else entirely, the color of her skin. The praise that came so easily to her white comrades seemed to be reserved for others. Olivia knew it was because of her race. The military was supposed to be a place where merit mattered above all, but the reality was often different. She had seen her white colleagues get promoted for doing the bare minimum, while she had to prove herself time and time again, showing not just her skill, but her strength in the face of relentless prejudice. The irony was not lost on her. She had fought and bled for a country that, at times, seemed unwilling to acknowledge her contributions, her worth. She had taken bullets for people who would turn their backs on her in the blink of an eye, just because of her skin color. But that was the life she had chosen, and it was a life she had come to accept. As the plane leveled out and the flight attendants began to offer drinks, Olivia snapped back to reality. She looked around the cabin, the quiet hum of the plane settling into a rhythm. The tension from earlier had subsided, but she could still feel the eyes on her. A few passengers had turned their attention back to their magazines or the movie they were watching, but Olivia could tell that some of them were still uncomfortable with her presence. It was as if they couldn't understand why she was sitting here in first class, why a woman like her was entitled to the same comforts and luxuries as anyone else. Olivia had always known that there would be battles beyond the physical ones she fought on the front lines. She had always known that her journey would be fraught with obstacles, both seen and unseen. But there were moments, like this one, when it felt as if the fight was never ending. Her mind drifted again, this time to the faces of the people who had supported her throughout her life, the ones who had helped her rise above the prejudice, who had instilled in her the belief that she was worthy of every opportunity that came her way. Her parents had been the first to teach her that lesson. They had taught her that no one could take away her dignity, no one could strip her of her worth. They had seen the struggles she would face and had prepared her for them, telling her from a young age that she had to be twice as good to be seen as equal. They had given her the tools to survive in a world that was often hostile and unwelcoming. But they had also taught her to never let that world define her, to always hold her head high and to never back down from a challenge. As Olivia sat in her seat, the quiet hum of the plane offering a moment of peace, she knew that this was just another chapter in a much larger story. She was used to being overlooked, used to being underestimated. But what the man in first class hadn't realized, what the passengers who looked at her with disdain didn't understand, was that Olivia Carter was a force to be reckoned with. And no matter how many times she was made to feel like she didn't belong, she would continue to fight. She had earned her place in this world, and no one, could take that from her. As the plane flew on, Olivia closed her eyes again, not in defeat, but in resolve. She had faced adversity before, and she would face it again. But each time, she would emerge stronger, more determined, and more certain of who she was and what she had accomplished. This battle, like all the others, was just one step on a journey that would ultimately change the world. And she would be there to see it through. The power of silence. As the plane cruised above the clouds, the seatbelt sign switched off, and Olivia settled deeper into the plush chair, her mind still racing. The murmurs from her fellow passengers had quieted, and the clinking of glassware from the flight attendants added a soft, rhythmic background to the otherwise still atmosphere. Olivia looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the endless sea of clouds stretching out below her. The sky was vast, and in its infinite expanse, she felt a momentary sense of freedom. Up here, away from the world's prejudices and judgments, she could breathe a little easier. But even amidst the serenity of the flight, a sense of discomfort lingered. The incident with the man had left its mark on her. It was not just the direct confrontation that unsettled her, it was the underlying message that she, as a black woman, was somehow unworthy of certain spaces, even with a valid ticket, even with the same rights as anyone else. She had fought in foreign lands, faced life and death situations, but it was in the everyday moments of life where the real battles were often fought. The silent discrimination, the subtle ways people sought to remind her that she didn't belong, were harder to deal with than any combat situation. On the battlefield, you knew your enemies, and you could fight them head-on. In civilian life, the enemy was often invisible, lurking in the form of casual racism, ignorance, and unconscious bias. Olivia's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice from behind her. "Can I get you anything, Miss Carter?" It was one of the flight attendants, standing with a polite smile. Olivia smiled back, trying to push aside the lingering tension. "Just some water, please," she replied. The flight attendant nodded, and as she moved away, Olivia couldn't help but notice how differently she was treated compared to some of the other first-class passengers. While the attendant had offered a polite smile and a soft tone to Olivia, she had noticed the more exuberant attention given to the white passengers, especially the ones who had been vocal in their disapproval of her presence. It wasn't that Olivia wanted special treatment, she never did. But it was hard not to notice the stark contrast in how she was treated in comparison to others. She had worked hard to get where she was, fought battles both on and off the battlefield, and yet, for some, she was still a second-class citizen. It was as if the recognition of her humanity, her worth, was contingent upon how others perceived her. She had learned to let it go, but it still hurt, each and every time. She shook her head, trying to push the negative thoughts aside. Olivia knew all too well that dwelling on these things wouldn't change anything. It was a system of beliefs, a framework built over centuries of history, and it was not one person, not one interaction, that could change it. But it was in these moments that Olivia had learned the most about herself. She had learned how to persevere, how to hold her head high in the face of adversity, and most importantly, how to maintain control over her reactions. As the flight continued, Olivia found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her here, to this moment of tension and discomfort. Her decision to join the military hadn't come easily. Growing up in Georgia, she had been raised in a working-class family, one where every penny counted, and every opportunity was hard-earned. Her parents, both of whom had worked tirelessly to provide for their family, had always emphasized the importance of hard work and education. But despite their best efforts, the world around Olivia had seemed to constantly push against her. She had been an exceptional student in high school, excelling in her studies and athletics. But even then, she had felt the sting of racism. She had been the only black girl on the varsity track team, and while her teammates cheered for her when she crossed the finish line first, they had never truly accepted her. There were always whispers in the locker room, sideways glances, and subtle comments about affirmative action that tainted the victories she had earned. It wasn't until Olivia had turned 18 that she had decided to leave her small town behind and join the U.S. Marines. It was a bold decision, one that surprised her family and friends. They had all expected her to go to college, follow a more traditional path. But Olivia had always known she was destined for something greater, something that would challenge her, test her limits, and force her to confront not just the world around her but the demons inside her. The Marines would offer her discipline, structure, and purpose, things she had lacked in her small town where she had felt unseen, overlooked. But even in the military, Olivia's race and gender often set her apart. She had been told more times than she could count that she wouldn't make it, that women didn't belong in combat roles, that a black woman could never succeed in a male-dominated environment. She had proven them wrong, over and over again. She had become one of the few black female Marines in combat units, earning respect from her fellow soldiers not because of her race but because of her skill, dedication, and strength. Yet, no matter how much she accomplished, no matter how many obstacles she overcame, there were always those who saw her as something other than a soldier. They saw her as a symbol of racial quotas, a woman in a man's world. The constant need to prove herself, to show that she belonged, wore on her after a while. The exhaustion of having to fight not just for her place in the world but for her right to exist in spaces where others took their place for granted was something she could never escape. The flight attendant returned, offering Olivia the water she had requested. As she sipped it, Olivia could feel the weight of her thoughts begin to settle. She glanced around the cabin again, this time noticing the subtle changes in the atmosphere. The man who had initially questioned her presence in first class was now sitting with his arms crossed, his face sour, and his gaze averted. He was trying, with all his might, to ignore her existence. Olivia couldn't help but notice the way the other passengers were reacting to him. Some looked away, pretending they hadn't heard his earlier remarks. Others had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly aware of the tension. But Olivia knew something most of them didn't: silence was powerful. It wasn't just a way to avoid confrontation, it was a weapon in its own right. In silence, there was strength. In silence, there was clarity. She had learned, through years of training and battle, that sometimes the best way to deal with hate was not to respond in kind but to stand firm in your truth and let your actions speak louder than words. As the flight stretched on, Olivia's mind drifted back to the lessons she had learned in the military, the wisdom imparted by her commanding officers and fellow soldiers. They had taught her that it wasn't enough to just fight in the battlefield. The real battle was in your mind, in your ability to remain calm, collected, and resolute, no matter the external chaos. And in this moment, as she faced the silent judgment of those around her, Olivia chose to stand in her own truth. She would not let their narrow views define her. The hours passed, and Olivia found herself lost in the comforting rhythm of the flight. She could feel the jet lag tugging at her, but the peace of the cabin, the soft murmurs of the attendants, and the hum of the engines helped lull her into a reflective state. As much as she wanted to push the uncomfortable situation from her mind, Olivia knew that she couldn't. There was more at stake here than just her flight home. This moment, this encounter, was part of a much larger conversation, one that she had been a part of for as long as she could remember. In that moment, Olivia made a silent promise to herself: she would continue to fight, but not with anger or hostility. She would fight with her silence, with her strength, and with her unwavering belief in herself. Because sometimes, the most powerful statement you can make is not with words, but with the quiet defiance of simply being who you are, unapologetically. And she would continue to do just that, one quiet act of defiance at a time. Reaching beyond the horizon. The soft hum of the airplane engines provided an almost hypnotic backdrop to Olivia's thoughts, but her mind was far from the rhythmic pulse of the plane. She sat upright now, her back against the plush first-class seat, her hands resting in her lap. Outside the window, the sky had turned a deep shade of indigo as nightfall descended. Beneath her calm exterior, Olivia's heart beat with a steady pulse of determination. The encounter with the man earlier had not faded from her memory. It lingered in the back of her mind, alongside 100 other moments from her past, moments where she had been made to feel small, invisible, or less than. Olivia had spent her entire life fighting to be seen, not for her skin color, not for her gender, but for her humanity. She wasn't just Olivia Carter, a black woman in the military, she was Olivia Carter, a person, with dreams, ambitions, and the same desires as anyone else. And yet, the world often failed to recognize that. This subtle, systemic prejudice, what she had come to call the quiet battle, was one she had fought for years. And it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the pervasive biases that existed throughout society, biases that impacted people of color, especially black women, at every level, from the workplace to everyday social situations. But here she was, sitting in a first-class cabin, a space that had, for too long, been reserved for others who believed they were entitled to it simply because of their race, their wealth, or their perceived superiority. Olivia had earned her place in this seat, just as she had earned every opportunity that had come her way. She wasn't just occupying space, she was making a statement. This was not just about a seat on an airplane, it was about the space she had fought for in this world. The man's words echoed in her mind, "I don't understand how someone like you could be sitting here. First class should be for people who truly deserve it." His words cut deep, more than he would ever know. But Olivia wasn't just going to let them sting and fade away. She had learned over the years that silence in the face of such words wasn't enough. It was time to speak out, not with anger, but with purpose. As the plane leveled off and the cabin lights dimmed, Olivia took a deep breath. The flight attendants had finished serving dinner, and the majority of the passengers were now focused on their entertainment screens or deep in conversation. But Olivia felt an undeniable need to address the situation. Not just for her own peace of mind, but for something much larger, something that spoke to the heart of the discrimination she had faced her entire life. Her hand instinctively reached for her backpack beneath the seat in front of her. She had carried this backpack with her for the entirety of her deployment, and inside it, there was something that she had used to process her thoughts during the hardest days, the small notebook she had kept with her in the field. The pages of the notebook contained the raw, unfiltered emotions of a soldier who had seen too much, but had learned to channel that pain into words. In the notebook, Olivia had poured her soul, writing about her experiences, her struggles, and her reflections on the world she was living in. The notebook had become her safe space, a place to process the emotions that could not be shared with anyone else. With steady hands, Olivia opened the notebook and took out a pen. She could hear the soft murmur of conversations around her, but she was focused now. She wasn't just writing for herself. She was writing for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had been made to feel like an outsider, for every person who had fought for their place in the world, only to have it questioned by others who felt entitled to that space simply because of who they were. "I know the world has a way of telling us where we belong and where we don't," she began writing. "It tells us that we are only worthy of the spaces that society has carved out for us. The spaces where we fit into the narrow boxes they have created. The boxes that tell us who we are, what we are capable of, and where we can go. But those boxes were never meant to contain me." Olivia paused, feeling the weight of her own words. The man's earlier comments had stirred something inside of her, something that she knew she needed to address. The weight of his prejudice had not been just an attack on her, but on everything she stood for. His words were a reflection of the barriers that society placed in front of people like her, barriers meant to keep her from stepping into spaces she had just as much right to occupy as anyone else. "When I was a little girl, I was told I couldn't be what I dreamed of being. I was told that a black girl like me couldn't be a Marine, that I couldn't fight for my country because people like me didn't belong there. But I didn't listen. I chose to believe in myself. I chose to push beyond the limitations others tried to impose on me. And now, here I am, sitting in a seat that someone else thought I didn't deserve. The truth is, I belong here. I belong in every space, every room, and every conversation that I choose to enter. I am not here by mistake. I am here because I've earned my place. Not because I was given a handout, not because of pity, but because I worked for it. I fought for it. The words flowed from Olivia's pen, each one a declaration, each one a silent defiance against the forces that sought to limit her. As she wrote, the tension she had been holding in her chest began to ease. This was her moment, her opportunity to make a statement not just for herself, but for all the people who had been told they didn't belong. It wasn't just about standing up for her seat in first class. It was about standing up for every person who had ever been told that their dreams were too big, their ambition too bold, or their presence too unwelcome. Olivia continued to write, her mind fully immersed in the words that were now taking shape on the page. She thought of her parents, who had always supported her, even when the world around them told them that their daughter couldn't succeed. She thought of the countless men and women she had served alongside in the military, who had seen her for who she truly was, not as a black woman, not as a female soldier, but as a person who could do her job and do it well. They had been her strength when she needed it most. I've faced hate, I've faced ignorance, and I've faced adversity that most people can't even begin to comprehend. But none of that has stopped me. None of that has made me shrink back into the shadows, because I know the power of my presence. I know the power of my voice, and I know the strength of my heart. I belong here. And the next time someone questions my place in this world, I'll remind them, I have earned it, and I will never apologize for who I am or where I'm meant to be. As Olivia finished writing, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The words she had written weren't just for the man in first class, they were for everyone who had ever been made to feel small or insignificant. She closed the notebook, feeling the weight of her own defiance settle into her soul. She had written her truth, and now, she was ready to live it. She looked out the window once more, watching the stars twinkle in the distance. The world below her was vast and full of possibility, and Olivia Carter was no longer willing to let anyone else define her place in it. This flight, this moment, was just one of many she would face in her life. But it was a reminder of her power, her resilience, and her unshakable belief in herself. She had fought for her place in this world, and she would continue to fight, not with anger, but with the quiet, unwavering strength that came from knowing she belonged everywhere. A legacy of strength. The plane continued its quiet journey across the sky, the soft hum of the engines filling the cabin as Olivia sat deep in thought. The initial sting of the man's words had faded, replaced by an unshakable resolve. She had taken the moment of silence to find peace within herself, to recognize that this encounter, however frustrating, was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Olivia had spent her entire life fighting to create space for herself, to be seen and heard in a world that often seemed to reject her. But in this moment, on this flight, she realized that her fight was not just her own. It was a fight shared by millions of others, people of color, women, and those who had been told, time and time again, that they didn't belong in certain spaces. The fight was not about occupying a seat in a first-class cabin. It was about something much deeper, the fight to claim space in a world that was not built for them, to live fully in a world that sought to limit their potential. Olivia's mind drifted back to her time in the military, to the battles she had faced and the lessons she had learned. It was easy to think of the military as a place of violence and conflict, a place where you faced an enemy on the front lines. But the real battle, Olivia had come to realize, was always within. The battle to prove that you could be more than the sum of the stereotypes, the biases, and the limitations that society tried to impose. The battle to maintain your sense of self, your dignity, and your integrity in a world that often sought to strip those things away. Her time in combat had taught her the value of resilience. She had seen her fellow soldiers face unimaginable horrors, and yet, they found ways to rise above, to continue fighting, and to emerge from the darkness. It wasn't the weapons they carried or the training they received that kept them going, it was their unwavering belief in one another, in their mission, and in their own strength. That strength had been forged in the fires of war, and it was a strength that Olivia carried with her every day of her life. But the battlefield wasn't always found in foreign lands. It was often found in the small, everyday moments, in the quiet battles that took place behind closed doors, in the hearts of those who dared to dream beyond what the world told them they could achieve. Olivia had learned long ago that she couldn't change the world by waiting for it to change itself. Change, she realized, came from within. It came from people who were willing to stand up, to speak out, and to make their voices heard. Change came from people like her, who had learned that the fight was never just about proving yourself, it was about helping others to see their own worth and to understand their own power. As the plane neared its final descent into New York, Olivia felt a wave of anticipation. She was going home, back to her family, back to the place where she could finally take off her uniform and breathe easy. But even as the excitement of returning home swirled in her chest, she couldn't shake the thought that her journey was far from over. The world she was returning to, the country she had fought for, was still a place where people like her were marginalized, where the fight for equality was still being waged. She thought about her younger siblings, how they looked up to her, how they were growing up in a world that still wasn't always kind to them. She thought about the future, about the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Olivia knew that her work was far from done. Her story, her fight, was part of a larger tapestry, one woven from the struggles and triumphs of generations before her, and one that would continue to be shaped by those who came after. The plane began its descent, and Olivia's heart beat a little faster. She was ready for what awaited her on the ground, but she was also ready for what lay ahead. She was ready to face the challenges that would come with being an advocate for change, for equality, and for justice. She had seen too much to stay silent, too much to turn a blind eye to the injustices that still existed. As the wheels of the plane touched down on the runway, Olivia felt a sense of finality, but also of renewal. She was home. But this time, she wasn't just returning to a physical place. She was returning to herself, to her mission, to her purpose. She had learned that her place in this world was not defined by others, it was defined by her actions, her beliefs, and the courage to stand firm in her truth. The moment she stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Olivia knew that she was no longer the same person who had boarded the flight just a few hours ago. She had learned something valuable on this journey, not just about the world around her, but about herself. She had learned that her worth was not negotiable, that she had earned every space she occupied, every victory she achieved, and every right to claim her place in this world. She made her way through the terminal, her steps confident, her head held high. She could feel the weight of the stares from some of the passengers, the ones who had silently watched her during the flight, the ones who had whispered behind her back. But Olivia didn't let it bother her. She had long ago learned to embrace the discomfort that came with being different, with being someone who didn't fit into the neatly packaged boxes society had created. As she walked through the crowded airport, her eyes found a familiar face in the crowd, her mother, waiting for her near the baggage claim. The sight of her mother, with her warm smile and open arms, brought a rush of emotion to Olivia's chest. Her mother had been there through every hardship, every struggle, and every victory. She had been her rock, her source of unwavering love and support. Olivia's mother stepped forward, her arms open wide, and Olivia rushed into her embrace. The moment they touched, Olivia felt a rush of comfort, of belonging, and of homecoming. The world outside, with all its prejudice and judgment, didn't matter in this moment. What mattered was this, family, love, and the strength to keep fighting. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Olivia realized something profound. The fight she had been engaged in was not just about confronting the prejudice of others. It was about embracing her own truth, her own value, and her own strength. It was about being the person who had the courage to stand in spaces where she was told she didn't belong. And in doing so, she had created a path for others to follow. Her journey was far from over, but Olivia knew that every step she took, every challenge she faced, was part of a larger legacy, a legacy of strength, resilience, and hope. She would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for all those who came after her, who would one day walk in the spaces she had fought to make theirs. As she walked out of the airport with her mother by her side, Olivia felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. The world was still full of challenges, but she was no longer afraid of them. She was ready to take on whatever came next, to continue building a future where everyone, regardless of their background, could claim their place in the world with pride. And with that, she knew, the fight had only just begun, but it was one she was destined to win.